Hi everybody, I'm Francesca Neville and I'm back with episode 2 of The Look. Today I want to talk to you about where I find my vintage. Lots of people ask me this question all the time. So I figured it's a nice piece of knowledge to share with you all. Let's start with estate sales. Estate sales are sales, they're also called tag sales. It's usually when a whole house is for sale and everything in it, and they try to get rid of everything in it first. A company comes in and they go through and price everything in the house. Estate sales can be really fun, and it's a really cool way to kind of walk through somebody's life. You can see their whole collection, everything in their home, from furniture to all their clothing and shoes. So I like estate sales for that reason, but I don't go to many estate sales because sometimes they can be really competitive and cutthroat. In New York State, there were people who would wait outside in all kinds of weather for 4 or 5 hours waiting for them to open the doors. And once you would get in there, if you could even make your way up to the closet, to the clothing, they would already be there, and they would have those huge black plastic bags, and they would just be stuffing clothes into the bags. So you didn't really get a chance to even look at what was there. So that's kind of what steered me away from estate sales. But I know in town here, I've been to some pretty friendly estate sales and some really cool ones too. Another way that I like to buy vintage is at auctions. Auctions can also get a little bit competitive, but that's kind of the fun of it, because you're bidding on something that you want, and somebody else might want that same item, and so it's like this bidding war, and it's exciting. It's like the chase and the catch. Auctions can be a little bit intimidating sometimes, especially if you've never gone to one and it's not a real friendly auction and people are sitting, very quietly and seriously. But there's more auctions that I've been to than not have been friendly and more relaxed. You can buy things in lots, like you can buy like a whole lot of dresses, like 20 dresses in one lot, or you can buy items singly if that's all you're looking to do. And the best thing to do, the best advice about going to an auction is always setting a limit for yourself. Just say, I will not bid over this amount because there have been times when I've gone a little bit crazy. But as you know, I'm a low-level vintage hoarder, so sometimes you see something and you just really want it. I also would buy a lot just directly from people. People, when I had the store, would bring items in and I would give them bulk pricing for their items. But my most favorite way to buy vintage was when people would come to me and ask me to come into their homes, because maybe they were moving out of their home to a different state and they had to downsize, or maybe they were moving into an assisted living situation, or somebody's aunt or grandfather had passed away and they had to go through their apartments or their homes and get rid of everything, and they knew that the vintage things were too beautiful to just toss or just hand over to a thrift store or whatever. But the reason that I loved that so much is because you really get a glimpse into that person's life and you get a story behind each piece. And it became so much more special to be able to pass that story on to my customers, or even just for me to know that the dress that I was wearing was purchased in Italy on a ski trip and it was her favorite dress. Or just, those little tiny details make it more special, just like your own personal belongings. So getting the story with vintage items is just my favorite thing. Another way I would get vintage is there are collectors who are also wholesalers, and sometimes they also have vintage shops, but they kind of do the footwork for you. They go around this whole country and they go to estate sales, auctions. They have their special places where they know to go and look, and they would bring me sort of a collection that was already, you know, picked over to my aesthetic for my store or my target market that I was trying to sell to. They knew what I would like to buy, so they would just bring it in bulk and I would give them, you know, one price for everything. So that was cool because I didn't have to do the footwork, because sometimes you just don't have the time, especially when you're selling a lot of vintage, all, you know, and you have like a physical store. And then there's of course thrift stores and secondhand shops. They are getting tough with any vintage from the 1980s and older. It's still, you can still find a lot of great stuff, but it has become more difficult since vintage has been so on trend and vintage shops are like a thing. And I mean, which is great because we want to reduce, reuse, and recycle, and a great way to do that is by not buying brand new clothing all the time. You know, reselling clothing and buying vintage or even just used clothing is a really good way to love the earth. So I still do go to secondhand stores and thrift stores, and it's kind of fun because it's a treasure hunt there. You have to really dig through stuff because some of them are really packed full, but that would be like Salvation Army, Goodwill, or any like small town thrift stores. It's always fun. Also, whenever I travel or drive anywhere or near or far, I like to stop at any sort of vintage or thrift or antique store that I see, because it's like, wow, what do they have in this little town? Or you find different things in different regions, of course. You know, like if you are thrifting out in California, you might find like a bunch of really cool vintage bathing suits or loungewear, you know, pool wear or something like that. So it's cool to shop in different areas. Like if you happen to find yourself in a different state, go look at their thrift stores or their vintage stores. You could find some cool stuff. There's also eBay and Etsy. I mean, my shop is on Etsy. You can always shop at Odd Twin on Etsy. But a lot of the stuff on Etsy is already curated, so they're asking maybe a little bit more for their vintage. But on eBay, you can still find a lot of people selling vintage for cheap because, you know, they went to an estate sale. They were probably buying something else, but they happened to get all this vintage stuff in with the deal or something, and so they're just trying to sell it off. So you can find a lot of really great vintage deals on eBay. And if you are looking to buy in lots of items, which means like a lot is multiples of the same thing or multiple dresses, like you can buy 50 dresses from the 1950s and 60s in a lot. So that's a really cool way to shop too if you are trying to find vintage. And then another thing is there's like flea markets or open air markets where vendors come and set up. You can find some really cool stuff in those places. In Brooklyn, there was a big flea market called the Brooklyn Flea, and that had so many vendors, so many amazing vintage vendors. Also, there's another one, I think it happens maybe in the springtime in Massachusetts. It's called Brimfield. So that has a lot of cool vendors. They sell all kinds of vintage stuff there, like telephone booths and luggage and furniture and clothing, you know, everything. So that's another thing I like to do, is I like to go to like vintage flea markets when I travel as well, because you meet a lot of interesting people and you can hear about how they shop and collect and see what kind of collection they have. So it's really nice. But for those of you who are tuning in who are in the Williamsport area, I thought I'd share a couple of my favorite places to go vintage shopping. We have a lot of the ARW stores in this region, and that's the American Rescue Workers. They have great stuff in their shops. And some of the shops are curated more towards vintage items, or they just, whoever is setting that shop, buying for that shop, just has more of a vintage aesthetic. But they also have 2 auctions every year in Williamsport, and they're vintage auctions, so you can get clothing, furniture, jewelry, glassware, so much cool stuff at their auctions. And Their auctions are very, very friendly, super fun, and it's a charity auction. So all the money that you spend goes to their charity to help people within our own community. So it's a really good cause too. Let's see, another place I love to go around here is called Stable and Loft. It's in Muncie, and that store is pretty amazing. The woman who owns that store, she has such a huge collection. There's so much jewelry to look at and hats on the walls. There's shoes, all kinds of shoes, beautiful shoes. They have children's clothing, women's clothing, and men's clothing. I think she has limited hours that she's open. So as soon as we're all able to leave our homes and go shopping again, you should look up Staple and Loft. It's a real fun place. Plan on spending a couple hours there. At least I do. And of course, you know, we have Salvation Armies and Goodwills. So I always, you know, browse around there whenever I get some free time. But we do have a lot of really cool places just right in this area to shop vintage. I guess that's all I have to tell you today. I hope it was interesting. I hope you learned something cool about vintage shopping. And maybe I'll see you out there when this shelter in place is lifted and we can go vintage shopping again. In the meantime, come back and join me here next week. I will talk more about probably my own collection and show you some of my, maybe some of the special things that I collect. Maybe I can show you more of that. But thank you for tuning in. Have a great week, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.